So I like this a lot. I have been talking about for a while, and I think this is fairly obvious. I don't think I'm like some genius for having this be my take. Essentially, the right-wing Republicans, they have no policy at all. They've got nothing aside cutting taxes for the wealthy, deregulating corporations so that the wealthy can continue to get richer, income inequality can continue to skyrocket, and more people are becoming poor and having to struggle to make ends meet. That is literally the logical extension of allowing Republicans to hold power, as well as, of course, oppressing people that aren't cisgender and white men. So I like a lot that people are kind of understanding that as well, that it is literally just an issue. The humanity of trans people is literally just being weaponized to distract people from the fact that Republicans have no actual policy that help any actual, average Americans. So I'm a pretty big fan of that. So if you haven't been paying attention, there are a lot of pressing matters on the minds of Americans and people the world over, especially people in Florida. So, of course, we had a story of a man who died after self-immolating in front of the Supreme Court. He was a climate activist. Wynn Allen Bruce, who was 50. This got almost no news coverage. This is, of course, as a warning about the impending climate crisis, which we are currently and have been for a while suffering the consequences of the inaction of. Also, we now have had recently on April 6th a NASA scientist who was arrested after chaining himself to Chase Bank as a part of global climate protests. And then also, of course, we've got the rising threat of sea level rise in the great state of Florida, the Sunshine State, which, as it would turn out, current data suggests that as many as 3.5 million people in Florida are at risk of coastal flooding, but at the current rate, an additional 1.1 million will be threatened by 2050. So, of course, you've got all this stuff going on about the climate, literally an existential threat to the lives and livelihood of literally the human species as we know it, and could potentially lead to all manner of told and untold suffering. So, in the midst of all of this incredibly important stuff, luckily we've got some politicians on the case, and Ron DeSantis has actually decided to throw his hat in to the ring and really start fighting for the things that are most important to the American people. He suspended a state attorney who happens to be a Democrat because the attorney vowed not to enforce Florida's new anti-abortion law, the pro-forced birth law that the state of Florida now has, removing the bodily autonomy and individual liberty of women and people who can give birth in the state, as well as not enforcing the laws against gender-affirming care for the youth of Florida as well. A pretty based state attorney, if you ask me, which, is why Ron DeSantis, he has to go, obviously. Because Ron DeSantis, he's not happy unless everybody who isn't him is suffering. That's just how it is. He's a Republican. It kind of comes with the territory. You become a Republican because you hate yourself, and then you continue to hate yourself while in office, and you use your power to make the people you hate suffer, including people who like you, because Republican voters also suffer under Republican leadership, because Republicans don't know how to govern because their entire politics is that they hate you and want you to suffer. So luckily, when the world is literally on fire, how about yours? And that's the way I don't like it, and I'm honestly not quite bored of that fact either. And also, Florida might be underwater soon. Luckily, Ron DeSantis is on the case and has decided to really put forward the issues that are most important to the continued survival of our species as human beings. And also, while I was looking for the story on this, as it would turn out, a lot of the far-right figures that are big fans of Ron DeSantis, and might even have some kind of public correspondence with Ron DeSantis. I would have to look into that more, but it would not shock me really at all. We've got Jack Posobiec, who noted 1488 poster, neo-Nazi extraordinaire, who has posted a article that says, DeSantis sends cops to physically remove suspended, quote, Soros-backed state attorney. Now, it is no secret that literally almost every single politician in our country, and even like the bureaucrats in our country, do get some amount of funding from wealthy people, corporations, etc., in order to win their races, because unfortunately in the United States, you need money to become an elected official, because otherwise you can't really run a competitive campaign. But for some reason, it is incredibly notable that the specific state attorney has been given some kind of assistance by George Soros. For those of you who don't know, George Soros happens to be a billionaire, which is pretty cringe in my opinion, but also Jewish, which is not cringe in my opinion. And that's why Jack Posobiec doesn't like him. That's why the far right doesn't like him. It's not because he's a billionaire, because they soy chug the cum straight from Elon Musk's dick. Also a billionaire, just happens to be based in their opinion because he's as fucking stupid as they are. But this one's Jewish, so unfortunately that's a no-go. That's a non-starter for Republicans. You're not allowed to do that, unfortunately. So that's interesting. You also got Dinesh D'Souza talking about, ooh, Soros backed. Soros backed from the post-millennial, which is literally just a rag. You've got whoever the fuck this is, Dan Bongino's outlet, apparently, I'm assuming, also talking about Soros backed, Soros backed. So that's interesting. And, you know, just a little tidbit, a little interesting information here, you know, just thought I'd throw that in there. So that's kind of neat. Also, in addition to that, in order to further help literally nobody in the state of Florida, which is supposed to be his job, Ron DeSantis, it turns out that Florida's Board of Medicine, after being, you know, would imagine influenced or inspired by the people who pushed this decision to happen, Ron DeSantis, the Florida's Board of Medicine has decided to accept a petition to essentially forcibly detransition trans youth in the state of Florida. It's not currently banned, but it does open up the possibility for standards of care in Florida to make it so that you effectively ban gender-affirming care for trans youth. We also had this story of Florida trying to make it essentially outlaw cross-dressing in public. So that would include, unfortunately, in the view of Republicans, trans women, because they think they're women in dresses or whatever, essentially making being trans and gender nonconforming illegal in public. You know, big liberty enjoyer. So says Joe Rogan, Ron DeSantis. Thank God we got that endorsement out of the way. You can watch our video on that if you're curious about more of that. So that's also a bit cringe. Now, the fight is not over, luckily. This does not mean that it is currently banned. Like I say, it opens up the steps to get to the ban. So if you are in Florida, bless your heart, bless your soul, and may God have mercy on your sorry ass. I'm sorry you happen to be in Florida. This is literally the ass crack of the United States. And in theory, probably shouldn't have the same kind of standing on the national stage in the United States until it gets its act together, but it does, unfortunately. Critical support to all the comrades in Florida. You happen to be from Florida, but nobody gets to choose where they're born, so some, I'm assuming, are good people. So if you are still in the state of Florida, highly encourage, if you find it safe for you to do so, to contact your representatives, contact anybody really that has a position of power in Florida, in your locality, in your city, at a statewide level. Call them, leave them a message, write to them, tell them not to, you know, support these kinds of things, because, you know, some amount of public pressure can be helpful. Also, join protests if you find that to be a thing that you're comfortable with. But speaking of the protests, because I find it interesting to bring up, and, you know, a bit of a hopium pill in the midst of all this. This is from YDSA, from Florida International University. LGBTQ orgs are holding a press conference in Fort Lauderdale outside of the Florida Board of Medicine hearing, where they are deliberating rules to ban gender-affirming healthcare for trans minors. YDSA members from across the state are in attendance. We'll post pics/updates here. So we got quite a few amount of people out here, which is pretty cool. Attendees are staging a die-in to represent trans people who have died and those who will be killed by reactionary anti-trans policies. Gender-affirming care saves lives and should be available for free to all people. The Florida GOP is deadly. This is actually true. This is not hyperbole. There have been studies that show that trans youth specifically, but all trans people broadly, if they have supportive parents, if they have supportive friends, local community members, and if they have access to gender-affirming care, the rates of depression that they experience drop dramatically, drastically. Also, rates of attempted suicide drop dramatically, drastically, given all of that. Obviously, housing insecurity, drops drastically as well with supportive parents and access to gender-affirming care. So to put in place any kind of legislation that prevents people getting that necessary healthcare is quite literally child abuse. We've gone over this on several videos before, and will lead to more people becoming depressed and potentially, unfortunately, thinking about or actually taking their own lives. And the unfortunate reality of that is that the right wing is aware of that. This is why the right wing, Republicans, conservatives, generally people that hate themselves and the world around them, always talk about, ooh, 41%, you're going to be the 40. They always talk about that, which one study showed was the rate of attempted suicide, not successful suicides, but rather attempted suicide in trans people. That's not really a statement of fact, it's a statement of intent. That's what they want to be the case, and they get excited anytime studies come out that show that number going up, because the simple fact of the matter is they don't want trans people to exist. It's incredibly clear. It's incredibly obvious. One of the main reasons why they don't want youth transition to be possible, even though it's been shown to be very effective in treating gender dysphoria and helping people who are trans, the reason why they are so focused on being an anti-puberty blockers or whatever, is that they understand that if trans people are allowed to transition earlier and earlier, like before puberty, for instance, after all of these evaluations from medical professionals, their parents themselves, essentially it allows those people to pass more and more. Meaning that because they don't go through a puberty that doesn't reflect their gender as it pertains to their biological sex, and instead they, go through the puberty of the gender that they do identify as, they end up passing more, they look more, they feel more, they behave more, and essentially exist more as the gender that they identify as, meaning that it is harder for right-wingers to clock them, to understand that those people are trans. And the reason why they don't like that, and the reason why they don't like gender-affirming care in general, is because not only that kind of, homophobia and insecurity that they have, but rather because they want to be able to identify trans people in the world broadly so that it is easier to oppress them. Right? So that they can abuse them, potentially do physical harm to them. Essentially, the we can always tell thing is not really a statement of fact, but rather a statement of intent, just like the 41% thing is. It's not a we can always tell as in they always can, because they most oftentimes can't, but rather they want to always be able to tell, which is why they're against all of these things. And it allows them to easily oppress them. It would be kind of difficult to, perhaps refuse people goods and services at whatever stores if there are transphobic people that own those stores, refuse people services at a governmental level if you can't really tell that they're trans, right? Or any, all manner of other disgusting, reprehensible things that Republicans would like to see done to trans people. And not only that, but this is a form of genocide. If this is allowed to go through, one of the ways that genocide manifests is you create the conditions that essentially make it so that the kids of the out group have to either be forced to become the in group or cease to exist, I suppose. So by making it so that trans youth can't access any services that they normally otherwise in a civilized country or state would be able to, essentially it takes them from that out group and forces them to be in the in group, forces them to be cis, at least in their biology, and obviously in their social setting as well, with those cross-dressing proposed bans, the anti-drag bans, and all that kind of shit. And it's not good. It's actually quite bad, I would say. So luckily we got people out there doing the damn thing, and hell yeah, it's pretty good. People are streaming into the Board of Medicine hearing. The room is filling out with supporters of trans people's right to healthcare. Though there is also a minority of anti-trans attendees wearing stickers reading, quote, "Let kids be kids." Yeah, well, letting kids be kids would be allowing them to identify as the gender that they identify as. I feel like that's fairly obvious. Protesters for trans rights are being arrested outside the building. Apparently, the police are claiming that they are, quote-unquote, trespassing. Famously, the state of Florida, relatively recently, has allowed for people to run over protesters if they happen to be in the way on the road. Usually, in civilized states, there are laws against that kind of thing. As it would turn out, Florida thinks that, if there's a bunch of, Black Lives Matter people protesting police brutality and they're blocking streets, you might not actually get in trouble for deciding to run them over in your car in the state of Florida. So that's kind of neat, I think. Surely not the sign of a state in decline or anything. The Board of Medicine meeting is open to the public. As far as we can tell, there have been no such arrests of the anti-trans attendees. This is not shocking to me. And then, of course, as it turns out, they ended up going forward with accepting the petition and starting the steps to banning it. Now, we also had, and this was before the actual hearing, from Miami Against Fascism, photos of signs being held outside the Florida Medical Board meeting today in Dania Beach, where DeSantis is seeking to ban gender-affirming care for trans youth and create waiting periods for adults. And you would imagine eventually just full-on bans for adults, too. It's just a harder argument to make because of, bodily autonomy and individual liberty arguments not really being on the side of Ron DeSantis and people that agree with him. We got, we are human beings, not a wedge issue. Very true. We got, stop feeding your base with our lives. Also true. And we got this very based sign that says, if the Florida Agency for Healthcare Administration is confused about gender dysphoria, the Mayo Clinic has a great website. This is actually not the sign I thought it was, but it's okay. I think we'll find it. So I like this a lot. I have been talking about for a while that, and I think this is fairly obvious. I don't think I'm like some genius for having this be my take. Essentially, the right-wing Republicans, they have no policy at all. They've got nothing aside cutting taxes for the wealthy, deregulating corporations so that the wealthy can continue to get richer, income inequality can continue to skyrocket, and more people are becoming poor and having to struggle to make ends meet. That is literally the logical extension of allowing Republicans to hold power, as well as, of course, oppressing people that aren't cisgender and white men. So I like a lot that people are kind of understanding that as well, that it is literally just an issue. The humanity of trans people is literally just being weaponized to distract people from the fact that Republicans have no actual policy that help any actual, average Americans. So I'm a pretty big fan of that. Elijah Manley, who is apparently a candidate for State House in Florida's 99th District, has been on the ground at this hearing and talking about it. Says, against the consensus of the medical community and the American Association of Pediatrics, Florida's Board of Medicine has voted to accept the state's position to ban gender-affirming care as it exists and essentially force detransition. And that is actually true. The consensus around the treatment of gender dysphoria, as well as trans people broadly, is that gender is a social construct and sex is a biological one. So these things are different. Your biological sex is a little bit more set in stone, though not entirely. Nearly every single observable metric as it pertains to the issue of trans healthcare is supported and backed up by scientific and medical consensus. And anytime Republicans do anything to oppress trans people, it would seem anyway, is in contradiction to the actual experts and science at hand. But they're okay with that, of course. So to buttress this point, the American Academy of Pediatrics actually put out a recent study, a new study, about the issue of trans people. This is the third quantitative study to test the hypotheses of, quote, rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is a conspiracy theory. It's also the third that found the data does not support the hypothesis. There's a roughly equal number of assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth trans youth, and the number of AFAB people is not exploding. So here's Jack Turbin, a doctor, who worked on this paper. Really handy thread on the matter. There's the actual link as well. Sex assigned at birth ratio among transgender and gender diverse adolescents in the United States. The full paper is here. It'll be a link to the description if you want to see the whole thing. But of course, I'll only be going over this brief thread. We examined two hypotheses. One, that youth identify as trans due to, quote, social contagion, and adolescents assigned female are more susceptible. That's the first hypothesis. And two, that youth identify as trans to flee LGB-related stigma. Neither was supported by the data. So to explain this one a little bit, they say only LGB because the conspiracy for this one is that, oh, well, some people only identify as trans because they don't like the homophobia they're seeing, right? So like, let's say there's a lesbian out there, a cis woman who is a lesbian. People are saying apparently that, oh, well, no, that person ends up only transitioning to be a trans man in order to avoid the oppression that they experience from being a cis lesbian woman, which is ludicrous on its face. The idea that people would go from being a cis lesbian to being a trans person in the modern context, in the modern day, to avoid oppression is fucking insane. Because currently, as far as I'm aware, there aren't a lot of bills and legislation being pushed by Republicans to make lesbians, cis lesbians, not allowed to be lesbians. Now, of course, they are against gay marriage. The Republicans are, and they have been pushing to overturn that. You've got Supreme Court justices in the activist Supreme Court, all the conservative activist judges in there, talking about, like Clarence Thomas, talking about how they should reassess the Obergefell decision, et cetera, et cetera. But currently, it does not seem that you face the same amount of oppression being a lesbian cis woman than you do being a trans man or a trans person in general. So the idea that you would try to evade the stigma of the other groups to be trans is stupid. It's just literally dumb. I don't know what else to say. So that's why they only say LGB, because they're talking about people going from the LG and the B over to the T, which you still remain within the LG and B, but that's why they word it that way. Yes, I totally decided to put my body through a massive hormonal and surgical change, deal with all the social bigotry just to get away from being LGB. That's totally it. Yeah, exactly. It's actually ludicrous if you think about it for more than 2 seconds. But luckily for Republicans and the Republican Party in general, through the indoctrination, the propaganda, and the outright lies being sold to the Republican base, those people, unfortunately, they can be saved, hopefully, but those people, unfortunately, don't have the brain cells to rub together to be able to think for a couple seconds to understand how stupid that idea is. So it ends up somehow becoming a convincing narrative. We used the 2017 and 2019 CDC Youth Risk Behavior Survey, a nationally representative sample of adolescents in the United States. Sadly, not all states choose to collect sexual orientation and gender identity data, so we included the 15 states that did. This meant 100,000 teens per year. In theory, it would be a good thing to collect this information, but I mean, for some people to stay under the radar in the current context is also not a bad play. We found that the percentage of adolescents who openly identified as trans actually decreased from 2017 to 2019, from 2.4% to 1.6%, arguing against the social contagion conspiracy theory. Kind of PogChamp. Would you look at that? Wow. Empirical data? Studies? Suggesting the opposite of what Republicans claim? No way. That could never be the case. Ever. Some small studies from gender clinics have reported a, quote, sex ratio plus L of more adolescents assigned female at birth relative to those assigned male at birth. Some have argued people assigned female are more susceptible to social contagion, and that this explains that sex ratio. Some have argued people assigned female at birth are more susceptible to social contagion, and that this explains that sex ratio. In this much larger sample, 100,000 in each year, we found that the sex ratio actually favored adolescents assigned male at birth in both 2017 and 2019. Though the ratio shifted toward those assigned female at birth in 2019, it was due to a decrease in those assigned male. So the reason why this particular conspiracy theory exists is largely, as far as I can tell, because of TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists or gender critical people, which are literally just, usually anyway, conservative cis women who hate everybody else and themselves and have decided to make it their life's mission because transphobia is literally a mental illness. I'm pretty sure you can have a very strong case to be made for getting it into the DSM-6 or whatever the next installment of that is going to be, because of the way it seems to destroy the lives of the people that engage with it and completely consume them to the point of like not even being able to like recognize the person they used to be. The idea is like, oh, well, all these would-be cis lesbians are deciding to trans they gender because, and that's really it. The substantiation after the because that I gave you there was essentially the same level of argumentation as the TERFs will give you. But that's, I think, why there's that big understanding there. But if you exist in trans circles ever at all, or even are on the periphery of trans circles on the internet or in person, you will come to realize that it seems to be the case that there are more trans women out there than there are trans men. That just seems to be the case. Obviously, it's not really a competition. Support to all of our trans people out there. I don't care really how you identify. But in this specific context, it just seems like you see more trans women. You would imagine part of that is because of the sheer amount of homophobia and transphobia that is directed at people assigned male at birth. The fact that you're gonna have a lot more very loud and open trans women, it seems to be correlated to that in some way. Because like they kind of have to be, because they are always the subject of discussion. You'll notice that except for in this social contagion conspiracy theory that gender criticals thought up, outside of that, like you're not really ever hearing about trans men. It's usually always trans women. And part of that could be because there just seems to be more of them. Frankly, I think, I mean, this is not scientific analysis, but I think that women are based more so than men, generally speaking. So it would make sense that people would prefer to be a woman. I mean, that's just my guess. I don't know. But it really all depends. I mean, we don't have really exceptional data on a lot of this because of the stigma around being trans and the active attempted, setting up of a genocide against trans people in the United States and around the world. From 2017 to 2019, the percent of those assigned female at birth who openly identified as trans actually decreased from 1.9% to 1.4%. Last, we looked at the rates of bullying victimization. We compared trans adolescents to cis sexual minority adolescents. The former had much higher rates of victimization in both 2017 and 2019, arguing against the notion that kids come out as trans to flee LGB-related stigma. Literally, one of the most obvious things you could possibly think of. Like, the fact that that's a talking point at all is ridiculous if you've ever interacted with a trans person ever in your life. But it is the case that a lot of people haven't, which is why you have, the ability for all this fear mongering to happen. This study comes as there are many political attacks against trans youth in legislative arenas. The social contagion of fleeing LGBT stigma hypotheses have featured prominently in these debates. We hope these new data will be urgently brought to those legislative discussions. I would not expect that to be the case except by left-wing people who are anti-trans oppression, anti-child abuse, and all this kind of shit. Republicans will never look at this study, and if they do, they'll just say that, Soros funded it or something like that and move on. So it is what it is, really. But having these studies is good. Of course, the right doesn't care about these studies because they literally just want you to suffer and hate you if you are not a Republican, cis, white, and a male. But, it's useful to have this for people who are on the fence, people who need a little bit more convincing, well-meaning liberals who aren't really fully sure of it. Generally speaking, if you're having arguments against right-wingers, you're probably not going to change their mind, but hopefully people in the periphery looking on to your debate or discussion or argument or wherever you're doing it will be convinced, and you can go from there. It is very helpful to have. And, the fact that the American Academy of Pediatrics put the study out right now is a very good thing. And it's quite PogChamp, if you ask me. So, in spite of all that, we still have Ron DeSantis and the state of Florida and a variety of states around the country, but specifically in the context of this video, DeSantis in Florida, contradicting scientific and medical consensus to push the oppression on people they don't like because it is politically expedient for them to do so and literally no other reason. It doesn't help anybody. It only hurts people. The only people it does help is the politicians running to get elected and the people trying to grift money out of being a transphobe. The transphobia industrial complex, as I have dubbed it, I have trademarked, I have copywritten that term, is alive and well and chugging along spectacularly. You can become elected as a Republican simply by saying that you want trans people to die. You can make money on the internet as an influencer or an existing celebrity simply by saying that you don't think trans people should exist. Because you can't really say that about gay people as much anymore because being gay has been normalized to the point where, it kind of hurts you to do that. So now trans people are the people that you can actually talk that kind of shit about and actually be rewarded for doing so, because there are less trans people than there are gay people, and the information surrounding it is unfortunately muddied with a mess of fucking degenerates like Ron DeSantis pushing bullshit that they should know are lies. And I would imagine they do. I just don't think that they care. So if you happen to be in Florida or any of these other states, Aaron in the Morn, very good Twitter account that I've talked about a lot on this channel, you should go follow, has put out in July a map of states that are at risk and states that are safe. So we've got the key over here. We got states with the safest protections. So if you're looking for, if you have the means to move from any of these states, I would not put it past you to even think about that, much less do it. If you are a person who is at risk of oppression on the basis of these reprehensible Republicans, if you have the means, the safest states are Washington, Oregon, California, Colorado, Illinois, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Hawaii. Those are the safest states. So if you want the safest play, you could come to the trans mecca of the United States, aka Seattle, Washington, if you can. I do not put it past you. Oh, that being said, I think, for one, not everybody's going to be able to move. And for two, not everybody wants to. And for three, there are going to be people that want to stay and fight, and you should try to support those people by donating to strike funds for any labor militancy that might be going on, by donating to protest funds, bail funds, for any protests that are happening, lending any kind of support online that you can if you're not in these areas, or actually, being there yourself, working with organizations, etc., etc., etc. Very good thing to do. The safest people to stay in states like this are obviously going to be cis white men, particularly cis white women as well, of course, but, with the anti-abortion shit, anybody that can get birth in these states is not very safe, but you are a bit safer if you are cis. So staying and fighting, because we know you got to have people on the ground protesting, you got to have people voting in these elections to try to get better candidates in there. It is a worthy fight, and you should always support the people that are doing it. But I do think if you find it to be necessary for your own safety to move and you have the means, it should certainly be at least a thing you think about. Oh, also, apparently DC is very safe as well, and that should be a state, but currently isn't. So then you have low risk within one election cycle, meaning that it's not the safest, but within one election cycle, and I would imagine that means the general election cycles, every 4 years, you're at lower risk. You've got New Mexico, Nevada, Minnesota, Michigan, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Maine, Delaware, Maryland. So if you're in any of these states, if getting to these places is a little bit better, it's an option. If it's easier to get to those states than the green ones, obviously, then there's that. Moderate risk within one election cycle. You've got all of these: Utah, Wyoming, North Dakota. I'm not going to say all of them. PA might be a pretty decent one, though it's a little shaky. Hopefully Fetterman gets in there. Hopefully Shapiro, no relation, wins the governorship in Pennsylvania as well against Mastriano. And PA becomes more and more of a pretty strong place, especially with the potential for labor militancy there. Being a Rust Belt state could be pretty poggers. Also, you're close to New York. All these states, of course, as well. I would imagine that Mississippi, Georgia, etc., while they are at moderate risk, you would imagine that they could become incredibly high risk at some point, so be careful. Then you got high risk within one election cycle. You got Idaho, Montana, West Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, all that. And then the worst states, and frankly, some of the least based states in our union in general, outside of the context of this topic, you got Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, and Florida. And if you're in those states particularly, or in any of the higher risk states, like I say, do not put it past you to think about moving if you have the means. There are also organizations out there like the Campaign for Southern Equality, which I actually talked to Keffels when she was doing a fundraiser for that organization that does provide funds for people to be able to move. There, I would imagine, are other organizations you could find out there, but that's the main one that I know about. So if you'd like to support them, you should. If you're looking for the support that they could give, there's one option there as well. Very important. Also, just to end on a bit of a happier note, a lighter note, speaking of states that are safer, California passed SB 107 out of committee with 11-4 vote, which makes California a safe haven for trans family refugees fleeing Texas, Alabama, and Florida. For trans teens who flee there, there's no medical cooperation, no extradition, no release of info, and no out-of-state child custody removal. So this was on August 4th. And so it'll go to a floor vote, and if it passes, it'll be pretty pog-champ. So that's cool. And also, which you've probably heard about already, Kansas, the great state of Kansas, which by this map is actually moderate risk within one election cycle when it comes to anti-trans legislation, has voted no on a bill that would have essentially allowed for anti-abortion, pro-forced birth legislation to be passed. So they protected abortion rights in the state constitution. In the first ballot test of abortion rights in a post-Roe America, Kansas voters turned out in historic numbers to overwhelmingly reject a constitutional amendment that would have opened the door for state lawmakers to further restrict or ban abortions across the state. The Associated Press called the race at 9:40 p.m. The Vote No campaign led 59% to 41% after all precincts in the state had reported. Very nice, very cool. So, as I've talked about on the stream before, that one Pew Research poll that showed that it is literally a bipartisan consensus, like Republicans and Democrats and independents all agree in overwhelming majority, which is a rare thing to happen apparently in this country, that Roe v. Wade should have remained the law of the land and that people's access to abortion and family planning services should be available. So the idea that the people of Kansas would vote in favor of keeping access to abortion legal and against things that would make it potentially illegal is not shocking to me at all. Everybody, regardless of their party affiliation, at one point or another, has to, like, either if it's a thing that they are fine with, or even if it's a thing that they normally wouldn't like to do but end up engaging with anyway. Bo, the Fifth Column, has good videos on this, where he talks about how there's usually some dirty little secrets going on in the South, specifically, about how the women and people who can give birth in those states will often make excuses to go out of state, or to go to places where they might be able to access an abortion. And they might actually vote in favor of keeping access to abortion available, but they won't tell anybody about it. It is actually a fairly common thing. So the idea that Kansas would vote against allowing the state constitution and any legislation against outlawing access to abortion and other related services is not surprising at all to me. However, this does kind of suggest that Democrats can stop being pussies about the issue of abortion and actually say it. You know, Nancy Pelosi famously not a big fan of actually saying the word abortion because they're worried it might hurt them. But, you know, if you needed a little bit more convincing, running on a pro-individual liberty, pro-bodily autonomy, pro-access to abortion should people want to make the choice to get one, pretty popular. People might be interested in that. So that's kind of cool as well. Representatives are always against abortion until it's their wife/daughter that gets pregnant. And that's one rule for me. Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. To be a Republican necessitates that you be a hypocrite. It necessitates that you be irrational. It necessitates that you disagree with the actual observable reality that you happen to exist within, because Republicans and conservatives have, since the dawn of time, been trying to rewrite history to cover up their mistakes and the evil shit that they do. It's not new. So that's a nice, happy note to end on. It's pretty cool. Pretty poggers. So, to any people out there who are in these states, best of luck to you. If you can get the help from a variety of these organizations, if you are thinking of fleeing the state that you're in, once again, completely don't put it past you. That is absolutely a thing that you should worry about. The highest priority that you should ever have as a human being is your safety. And if you feel unsafe and if you think you might fall victim to any amounts of oppression, there's no shame in potentially moving. I know a lot of people aren't going to want to because, 1, it's expensive, 2, it takes a lot of time and labor, 3, people got families in places that they want to stay around, but it is absolutely no shame in that. Things could potentially be better. Things are potentially looking up. Right-wingers in this country are seemingly less and less popular as time goes on, though, of course, if they're able to essentially undo democracy through more V. Harper, that's going to be a different story. But for now, it might be the case that in a post-Roe v. Wade being overturned America, the incumbent party, the Democrats, might not suffer as much in the midterms, and that could potentially lead to them not doing as much as they probably should, but maybe hopefully doing some amount of shit that's actually good. And the only way they're going to do that is by continued pressure from cool people like you. Where's Spawn Point? I live in Florida, and I've been wanting to start HRT only more and more as time goes on. Yeah, dirt nut. Sucks. The RNG of where you're born is pretty fucked. Because, being born in America is actually substantially better RNG than, the worst possible outcomes, unfortunately. Just because there's a variety of countries that have been fucked over by other more powerful imperialist forces and yada yada yada. And even then, being in, having your spawn point be in fucking Florida or Texas is, in the context of the US at least, pretty fucking bad. Shit's rigged and the devs have to patch it, I think. Anyway. This video's CONURE is none other than the bravest, the strongest, the most skillful editor on YouTube, Mr. High Progressive. Nepotism wins again, folks. You already know that High Progressive edits these fine videos that you're currently watching, and you should go follow him or you're a clown. If you'd like to be the next CONURE, all you gotta do is follow me on Twitter, @CONURECC, retweet my video links when they go live. Remember to subscribe to the channel, put all notifications on when you hit the bell, leave a like if you'd like, comment something about how trans people are cool, and everybody should be trans, and whatever else you really want to put down there, and have a great day.